Jon Snow stood on a lonely rise in the far north, where the wind howled over a pristine expanse of white that stretched endlessly toward an iron horizon. The sky swirled above him in turbulent layers of gray. His cloak, thick with the fur of a great direwolf, whipped around his body, and his dark hair had been pulled back from his face in a tight knot. He wore a bristled beard now, rougher than the stubble of his youth, evidence of nights spent in ice-bound wilderness. Everything looked as it had the day he first journeyed beyond the wall, a stark land of biting cold and sky-wide storms. Yet everything felt different. He was no longer the uncertain young man torn between the Night's Watch and the knowledge that he was the blood of both Stark and Targaryen. He was no longer bound by the same oaths that had once kept him chained in black. The old order had toppled, and a new life had begun. Still, the North seemed timeless in its severity. The wind that cut across Jon's cheeks, the crunch of snow beneath his boots, the low groan of the shifting ice. It was as though these sounds and sensations had existed long before any castle was raised to the south. Standing in their midst, he felt small and mortal, yet also oddly at peace. He was waiting. The free folk had set up camp not far from him, sheltered by a rocky outcrop, their tents staked into the snow. Thick pillars of smoke rose from their fires, and the smell of roasting meat drifted over the tundra. Ghost prowled among them, the great white direwolf visible only when he stepped into the glow of a campfire. Jon knew that if Ghost were to vanish into the snowy wastes, only the direwolf's red eyes would give him away. Jon glanced over his shoulder at the flickers of orange in the distance, the sounds of clanking pots, the raucous laughter of Tormund Giant's bane. Yes, they were a long way from the warm halls of Winterfell or the greater bustle of King's Landing. But from the moment Jon had led the free folk back beyond the wall, he had felt a sense of returning to a place where he truly belonged. Then the wind shifted, and Jon felt something. A presence that tugged at the corner of his thoughts, whispering, urging him to look northward into the thick gloom of an oncoming blizzard. He closed his eyes briefly and let the swirl of the wind rush past his ears, letting the frigid air invade his lungs. That subtle presence expanded until it was not just a whisper but a call. He opened his eyes again, scanning the horizon. Snow flurries danced across the half-light, and in the distance he saw a shape move, silhouetted briefly by the last remnants of day. He placed a hand on the hilt of Longclaw and exhaled, every breath turning to mist. He realized with sudden clarity that this was not just any scout or a stray traveler. This was the one he had been expecting, the only person who might come so far north to find him now, under the crown of cloud and perpetual winter. Jon descended the slope toward the figure. Step by step, his boots pressed into fresh snowfall. His hair whipped into his eyes as the figure resolved into someone seated on the back of a sturdy garron, leading a small group of guards. The lead rider was hooded in a thick cloak of soft gray. At first, the face was all shadows beneath layers of fur. Then the rider pulled back the hood. The flicker of recognition flared in Jon's chest. He had heard the stories, of course, from the ravens that still flew. He had read them in letters carried by devoted maesters, though he had never fully believed them until now. This rider was Brandon Stark. No, not just Brandon Stark, but King Bran the Broken, King of the Six Kingdoms, the boy who had once been pushed from a tower and left for dead, who had grown into something beyond mortal comprehension. Bran's hair was trimmed short, and his face was the same pale and distant mask that Jon remembered. Yet there was an age, an incomprehensible knowledge in Bran's eyes that dwarfed the years he had actually lived. He seemed both far older and yet heartbreakingly young at the same time. Jon sank to one knee in the snow. Though he had turned his back on the ways of Southern Court, he still respected the bond of family, and he had once sworn to serve the king of the realm. Even if that realm had exiled him to the far reaches of the continent, it was a courtesy to show this measure of respect. The others behind Bran fanned out, holding torches against the creeping gloom. Bran's voice was calm, faintly echoing with a gravity beyond his years. "Rise, Jon." Jon stood. He felt an ache in his chest at seeing his brother, half-brother, no cousin, he reminded himself. But to him, Bran would always be a brother. Jon stepped forward, reaching out to help Bran dismount. But Bran gently lifted a hand and signaled one of his guards to assist him. With ease, they guided Bran's wheeled chair from the back of the garron and set it on the snow, ensuring it was stable. The chair itself was wrought of dark wood and cunning metal hinges, a design that allowed him mobility over rough terrain, though the deep snow still posed its challenges. Once Bran was settled, Jon moved closer. "What brings you here?" he asked, voice low and half lost amid the keening wind. Bran's frost-gray eyes flickered with hidden emotion. "A need," he answered simply. "A calling that goes beyond the confines of the Six Kingdoms." Jon did not know how to interpret that. Instead, he gestured for Bran's party to follow him. "We have warmth and shelter," he said. "Food, too, though not what you'd find in King's Landing." Bran gave a faint, knowing smile. "Food will do well enough. Let on." They returned to the makeshift encampment. The free folk eyed Bran and his guards, some with open curiosity, others with a wariness that came from centuries of distrust of southern crowns. But Tormund Giantsbane, with his thick red beard frosted in ice, simply shrugged and beckoned them to join the biggest fire in the center of the camp. A few communal tents had been erected, bearing rugs and pelts that insulated them from the worst of the freezing ground. Bowls of stew were handed out, steaming in the cold air, and the men and women of the free folk loosened up enough to return to their conversations once they saw that Jon welcomed this strange newcomer. Within one of the larger tents, they arranged space for Bran to rest. Jon and Tormund joined him there, along with two of Bran's guards. Bran's cloak, once pulled away, revealed just how frail he looked, an otherworldly slenderness, as though the wind might carry him away. Yet that fragility was balanced by an aura of wisdom and hidden power. Jon offered him a bowl of stew. Bran accepted it and took a few measured sips, all the while gazing at the swirling patterns in the flames of the nearby brazier. Tormund cleared his throat awkwardly and left them in privacy, nodding once to Jon. After a moment, Bran turned his unblinking stare on Jon. "We have not spoken since we parted ways outside the Red Keep," he said. Jon nodded slowly, remembering that last meeting. He had been sent to the Wall in a compromise demanded by the lords and ladies of Westeros. Tyrion Lannister had been the architect of that arrangement, if memory served. "I remember," Jon said. "I never thought I'd see you here." "Things have changed," Bran replied. "And I have changed, more than you know." He paused. For a moment, the only sound between them was the crackle of fire. Outside, they heard the muffled voices of the free folk, jokes and laughter, sometimes curses at the biting cold. "What I am about to say may sound impossible," Bran continued, "but I would not have come all this way if it wasn't necessary." Jon studied his face. "Say it." "The magic of the North is not gone," Bran told him. "The threat we faced at the Long Night was only one part of it. The walkers are destroyed, the whites have collapsed, but the power of ice is still here. It courses under the land, locked in the heart of winter. Over the centuries, that power has belonged to different hands, from the first men to the children of the forest, from the Night King to the three-eyed raven and beyond. If it is not shepherded, if it is not guided, it may rise again in a more terrible form." A stir of old dread moved across Jon's heart. He had witnessed the devastating might of the Night King. He had seen the undead break over the living like a wave of unstoppable darkness. The notion that the North held more secrets, more capacity for terror, did not surprise him. But the idea that Bran might seek it out was unsettling. "And what do you intend to do with this power?" Jon asked quietly. Bran placed the half-empty bowl of stew aside. His thin hands folded on his lap, and for a moment, he appeared more statue than man. "I've touched it before," Bran explained. "In visions, in half-remembered dreams. There is a presence in the far north, a presence as old as the world. When the Night King was destroyed, that presence receded, fell into a deep slumber, but it did not vanish. And now the wards that once guided that power are broken. The realm is vulnerable." Jon's brow furrowed. "Vulnerable to what?" Bran tilted his head, almost bird-like in the motion. "The unknown. We do not know what shape that old power might take now. We do not know who, if anyone, could harness it. But if we do not address it, I fear it will rise again in chaos. We must restore balance. Jon's eyes traveled to the tent flap, through which he could see a swirl of icy air. Is that why you came for me? In part, Bran said, his voice pitched low. Because you are of the North in every way that matters. Because the blood in your veins is that of both ice and fire. Because you have walked beyond the wall, and you have died and lived again. If any living soul can help me channel the magic that resides in this land, it is you. A half-disbelieving chuckle escaped Jon's lips. I'm no wizard, Bran. Bran's expression never wavered. Nor am I. Not in the way of old stories. But I am tied to this land's memory. Past, present, and future. And you are tied to its beating heart. We do not need to be wizards. We only need to be conduits. Silence spooled out between them. Then Bran lifted his gaze. Together, he said, we can ensure no new threat like the Walkers emerges. We can unify the warring powers of ice. But we must journey further north than any have ever ventured. Past the lands of always winter. Past the cold deserts where no man treads. Jon recalled old stories told by the free folk. A land where the cold was a living entity, where the sun barely rose, where monstrous shapes prowled the ice. Even Mance Rayder had never been so far. But Jon felt a strange pull, an inexplicable resonance, in Bran's words. You speak of forging an ice kingdom, Jon said, cautious. One that will stand guard over the rest of the world. Bran nodded once, grave. Yes, a kingdom without walls or banners in the traditional sense. A kingdom of the cold, bound by a primal oath to keep the darkness in check. The memory of the long night must not be forgotten or left to fester. Jon let out a long breath, half laugh, half resignation. You always did see more than the rest of us, he said. His eyes flicked to Bran's, searching for doubt, but saw none. If I do this, how will it even work? Bran's guards remained silent, stoic as statues. Outside, the wind rattled the tent, and somewhere Ghost let out a low, mournful howl. Finally, Bran replied, I do not have all the answers. The journey itself will reveal what we must do. For a moment, Jon said nothing. Images of warm halls and simpler times danced through his head. Fleeting memories of Winterfell's courtyard, of a world where he had once been just a bastard boy staring at a sword for the first time. Then he dismissed the thoughts. He was beyond that life, beyond illusions of respite. Then we go, he said firmly. Whatever lies north, we'll face it together. The next day, they prepared to move deeper into the savage cold. Tormund was the first to approach Jon, his thick arms crossed, a skeptical grunt rumbling in his throat. We going on another mad quest, Crow? Jon nodded. We are. But it's not a fight, not exactly. We're searching for something. A place or a power. Tormund spat onto the snow. Humph, power. Sounds like something I can't just punch. But I'll come along for a bit. The free folk can wait. They're used to me wandering off with you. Honestly, I'll never understand half the things you do. But somehow you always end up saving us from the next big disaster. Jon gripped Tormund's shoulder. Not sure I understand it either, but I'm glad to have you. Then he added, we can't bring too many people. It might be dangerous. More than dangerous. Tormund raised a shaggy eyebrow. I won't bring the whole damned clan. Just a handful. The wildest of the lot, the best survivors. You can count on that. So, a small expedition was formed. Bran had brought 4 guards loyal to House Stark. Tormund chose 5 of the hardiest free folk, each as weather-beaten and stubborn as the next. Jon brought Ghost. Any more would be a burden, straining their resources, and the deeper they went into the true north, the harder it would be to sustain a large party. Supplies were packed onto sleds. Bran's wheelchair was loaded onto a specially crafted sled for the rougher terrain, and a stout garron was kept as an alternative, should the land allow. Though one never knew beyond the known paths, it was possible they would face cliffs, crevasses, or labyrinthine ice fields. The day they set out, the sky was a bleak white, The wind had calmed enough to allow for travel, but a light snowfall dusted their cloaks and hoods as they departed the main camp. The free folk who remained behind had expressed their well wishes, along with no small measure of foreboding. Old Nan had never come this far, but Jon recalled her tales. They echoed in his mind, fueling a quiet dread that settled in the pit of his stomach. Yet his resolve was firm. They pressed north, over fields of snow and shards of ice that cracked underfoot. They followed the line of ancient hills, rarely glimpsed by anyone south of the wall. Ghost ran ahead, scouting in silent bounds across the frozen drifts. Bran often seemed lost in his own thoughts, or in a place beyond them. From time to time, he would speak in low tones to Jon, describing half-formed visions of an old glacier, a hidden valley of pale blue ice, a lake that never thawed even at the height of summer. Jon listened intently, trusting that these glimpses would guide them. They trudged for days. The nights were bitter, often spent huddled around meager fires, the wind howling like wolves in the darkness. Their rations held, but game was scarce. An occasional hare, once a roaming herd of elk that Tormund's hunters managed to bring down. The further north they got, the more the land became a study in emptiness. Even the hardy shrubs and crooked pines vanished, replaced by tundra that extended to the horizon, broken only by jagged ridges of ice. Then, one night, as they camped near the foot of a looming ice formation, Bran's eyes went blank. He slumped in his sled, and Jon rushed to catch him before he fell sideways. The others stirred anxiously, not sure what was happening. Then, as quickly as it started, Bran's eyes fluttered back into focus. He shivered, his breath ragged. "What did you see?" Jon asked, voice hushed. Bran's voice was distant. "A fortress made of ice. Not like the buildings men craft. It is shaped by magic older than men." He swallowed, as if tasting something foul. "We must find it. There. The heart of winter beats beneath the ice." They followed the compass of Bran's vision, day by day, forging deeper into the unknown. By now, Tormund's brash good humor had dulled into a wary silence. Even the free folk spoke only in hushed tones, as though afraid to wake something sleeping under the snow. But no matter how far they went, the land stretched on, swallowing them in vast emptiness. The only sign of direction came from the nightly transformations of the sky, from the pale glow of the day to the swirling auroras of night, dancing overhead in ribbons of green and purple. Finally, after a week or more, they came upon it. At first, Jon thought it was a mountain rising from the horizon, a monolith of ice. But as they neared, he realized it was something else entirely. Great walls of crystalline ice soared upward, forming an immense shape half buried in the drifting snows. It had the symmetry of structure, though battered by countless storms. Massive spires rose, sculpted in grotesque forms by the wind. An eerie light emanated from within the ice itself, a pale glow that made the inside seem to shimmer like trapped starlight. They halted at a respectful distance, the entire expedition stunned into silence. Even Tormund muttered a soft oath. One of Bran's guards, a man named Ser Ivor, made the sign of the seven upon his breast, though they were far from any sept. Bran's voice cut through the hush. "This is what remains of the fortress once ruled by powers we only glimpsed in the Night King. Predates him. Possibly it was the seat of the others in ages past." He turned his unblinking gaze on Jon. "We must go in." Ghost let out a low growl, the fur along his spine bristling. Jon placed a hand on the direwolf's flank, gently calming him. The others exchanged nervous looks, but one by one, they advanced, leading the sled that carried Bran closer to the fortress. Up close, the ice walls loomed like labyrinthine cliffs, carved into half-formed arches and spires. It was impossible to tell where wind-worn sculpture ended and deliberate architecture began. The fortress dwarfed any castle in the south. Winterfell, the Red Keep, the Eyrie, all would pale in comparison. And yet it was silent, suffused with a sense of timelessness that stirred unease in Jon's chest. At the main entrance, if it could be called that, they found a massive archway wide enough for 20 men to ride abreast. The top was jagged from collapse, the edges refined into ridges that looked like fangs of an enormous beast. Within, darkness beckoned. No gate or door blocked the passage, just a corridor that sloped downward into flickering twilight. Jon looked at Bran. "Are you sure?" he asked, voice echoing slightly in the quiet. Bran inclined his head, eyes reflecting the faint light of the ice. "We've come this far." Tormund snorted. "I might as well see what's inside. Not like we can turn back after a trek like that." Still, he palmed the hilt of his axe, knuckles whitening. They ventured in carefully, torches flaring orange against the bluish interior. The corridor's walls were both smooth and segmented in irregular patterns, as though natural ice had been fused by a purposeful craft. Footsteps sounded hollow on the frozen floor, and occasionally, shards of snow and ice tinkled from overhead. Their voices, too, echoed strangely, as if something was listening deep below. Despite the fortress's grand scale, they encountered no inhabitants. No bones, no traces of the Night King's old army, no leftover whites. The emptiness felt oppressive, as though a million invisible eyes watched them from behind the walls. Echoing passages branched off, each corridor pulling them deeper into the gloom. Bran seemed to know which way to turn, leading them through a labyrinth that none of the rest could have navigated alone. At length, they arrived at a vast central chamber, so large that their torchlight failed to illuminate its edges. Columns of ice soared up into the darkness, and overhead, vague shapes suggested a domed ceiling. At the center of the floor lay a circular dais, carved of the same glowing ice that composed the outer walls. A sense of presence radiated from that dais, an aura that made the hair on Jon's arms prickle even through his thick furs. Bran signaled a halt. Jon nodded, and the group spread out in a cautious ring. "What now?" Jon asked quietly, stepping closer to Bran's sled. Bran lifted a trembling hand and pointed to the dais. "We stand together upon it," he said. "You and I. We must awaken what sleeps." Tormund and a couple of the free folk started to protest, but Jon silenced them with a raised palm. "If we do this, can we control it?" he asked Bran. Bran's thin lips parted in an exhalation. "If we do not, it will awaken on its own in time. Better that we stand as the ones to greet it. Better that we claim it in the name of protecting the realms." Jon looked at the dais. It pulsed with a faint luminescence, reminiscent of the glow in a White Walker's eyes, or the sheen of newly fallen snow under moonlight. He felt his heart pound harder. He glanced at Ghost, who had taken a stance of ready tension, hackles up, as though on the verge of a fight. But the dire wolf did not snarl. Instead, his ears flicked forward, uncertain. Jon walked forward, each footstep scraping softly on the ice. Bran's guards pushed Bran's sled behind him. They reached the edge of the dais, which rose only a few inches above the floor. The swirling lines in the ice suggested unnatural patterns, not quite symmetrical, like an alien script. Taking a breath, Jon lifted a foot and stepped onto the platform. He felt a cold like none he'd ever known radiate through the sole of his boot, piercing his bones. Ghost barked, but Jon waved the direwolf back. Bran's sled was maneuvered so that the wheels aligned at the dais's edge. With the help of his guards, Bran rose just enough to shift onto the platform, balancing precariously. His hands trembled. Jon knelt beside him, offering an arm for support. As soon as Bran was in place, an almost imperceptible hum filled the chamber. Tormund gave a start, backing away, while the others gripped weapons, eyes darting around for any sign of enemies. A faint swirl of wind seemed to spiral overhead, stirring the darkness under the dome. Bran reached for Jon's hand, and Jon clasped it. A shock of biting cold rushed through Jon's arm. He gasped. It was more than physical cold. It felt like he was plunging into an icy ocean of memory, hearing ghostly echoes of ages past, glimpsing fleeting images of the children of the forest, the first men, the White Walkers, all swirling around a great weirwood hidden under black ice. He saw the ravens, 1,000,000 of them, swirling in a dark sky, each eye a window to the labyrinth of time. He glimpsed faces: Ned Stark, Robb Stark, Sansa, Arya, the old maesters, the Targaryen dragons, all merging into a tapestry woven of endless threads. The dais beneath them glowed brighter, illuminating the entire cavern with pale radiance. Then the hum built into a low, thrumming tone, like the resonance of a distant horn. Jon felt his soul pulling away from his body, but he held onto his sense of self by anchoring his thoughts to Ghost, to Tormund, to the living, breathing world he knew. At the same time, he felt Bran's presence envelop him, a calm, guiding hand in this torrent of ancient magic. The next moment, the dais's glow intensified, and an eruption of cold light shot up around them in twisting pillars. Tormund and the others stumbled back, shielding their faces from the sudden glare. A frosty wind blasted outward, and frost crystals spread across the floor in intricate patterns, creeping up the columns that supported the dome. Jon heard Bran's voice echo in his mind, though Bran's lips did not move. "We are forging a bond. The power of ice must be claimed, not resisted. Guide it, Jon. Temper it." Jon felt the swirl of energy surge through him. Part of him was terrified. The memory of the Night King, those piercing blue eyes, rose in his mind. He feared that by tapping into this power, they were giving it new life. But he also understood that if they did not harness it, no one would stop its eventual awakening. He gritted his teeth, focusing on the image of Winterfell, of the dire wolf sigil, of everything that was honorable and pure in the north. In that instant, the swirling beams of cold light converged, forming a spiraling vortex that plunged straight down into the dais. A deafening crack reverberated through the fortress. The chamber shuddered as the column of light collapsed into the ice. Where it struck, the floor opened, revealing a deep pit carved into the shape of a perfect circle. The glow emanated from its depths, and out of that glow, a shape began to form. It emerged slowly, as though molded from living frost. A figure, tall and slender, pale as moonlight, stepping onto the dais. Jon's heart lurched, expecting the visage of a White Walker. But the face was indistinct, its features shifting in and out of clarity. The eyes held not the cold blue flame of the others, but a swirling silver mist. It looked at Jon and Bran without hostility, an unreadable expression set upon its sculpted features. Bran's guards tensed, swords drawn, but Bran's voice, speaking aloud this time, echoed in the cavern. "Stand down. Do not provoke it. This is a manifestation of the power that sleeps here." Jon slowly released Bran's hand. He stood, his breath misting. The figure raised an arm, palm outward, as though greeting them. Its entire body was fashioned of swirling, semi-transparent ice, and the air around it shimmered in luminous waves. Suddenly, images flashed in Jon's mind again, of a cold kingdom that stretched across the polar ice, majestic and terrible, of robed entities kneeling at a pale altar, of swirling blizzards that whispered with voices. He saw glimpses of a pact made in a time before living memory, a pact now broken. The figure was the echo, the caretaker, the remaining vestige of that pact. Bran's voice rose, strong despite his frail body. "We have come to renew the vow," he said, words resonating in the chamber. "We stand as watchers on the edge of the world. We claim no dominion over the living, but vow to keep the dark from swallowing the light. This is our oath to the realm." The figure nodded, or seemed to. Then it knelt on the dais, pressing its palm to the icy surface. Another surge of light flared, bright enough to force Jon to close his eyes. He felt the wave of cold pass through him like a living wind, and a sudden, unmistakable sensation of a bond being forged, of ancient locks turning into place. When he opened his eyes, the figure was gone, and the dais had returned to its prior, faint glow. The hum had ceased. Bran slumped forward, nearly falling off the sled. Jon and one of the guards caught him, helping him remain upright. For a moment, nobody spoke, hearts still hammering. Tormund finally broke the silence. "What in all the hells was that?" Bran lifted his gaze, expression far away. "An emissary, the shape of the old magic. We have awakened it but also bound it. It will no longer wander as the Night King did, seeking to destroy. Instead, it will remain here in this fortress, unless we call upon it, unless we feed it with darkness. Jon swallowed, still feeling the aftershocks in his bones. So, it's done. Bran shook his head. Not entirely. The fortress lies dormant no more. The next step is ours to shape. The power of ice is not a single being, nor a single will. We have made contact with just one face of it. Jon let out a ragged exhale. He glanced at Tormund, who met his gaze with equal uncertainty. They had come to prevent a new threat from arising, but it felt like they had only pulled back the curtain on an even greater mystery. Still, they were alive. No monsters beset them. The fortress was awakened, yes, but it seemed they had, at least for the moment, tamed it. They spent that night in the grand hall of the fortress. Torches flared in improvised sconces hammered into the ice columns. The entire place gave off an ambient glow, so they needed less firelight than they might have otherwise. In the distance, the fortress's passages stretched out in every direction, many of them blocked by collapsed ice or twisted into labyrinths. But for now, they chose to remain in the main chamber, near the dais. Sleeping was difficult, for the air was cold enough to make each breath painful, and the sense of being watched continued. Yet, fatigue overcame them eventually, and they managed to rest in shifts. In the morning, or what passed for morning in this perpetual half-light, Bran seemed stronger oddly enough. The color in his cheeks was faint, but it was there. He asked Jon to will him back onto the dais. Jon did so carefully, feeling the tension in the air. The dais had gone dormant, but its faint glow persisted, making it look like a slab of living ice. This time, nothing stirred when Bran rolled onto it. No manifestation or swirling lights. Instead, Bran closed his eyes, and his chest rose in a slow, measured breath. When he opened his eyes again, he told Jon in a quiet voice, "There is more to do." They delved into one of the corridors leading off the central hall, guided by the flicker of invisible signposts Bran claimed to see. The corridor spiraled downward, taking them deeper into the heart of the fortress. Here, the ice grew clearer, and they could see pockets of strange shapes frozen in the walls, twisting branches of what might have been petrified wood, fragments of bone, or the silhouettes of faces reminiscent of the children of the forest. A hush settled over the group, broken only by the crunch of boots on frost and the rasp of cold breath. They eventually came to a grand door, hewn from a single slab of dark ice. It bore markings reminiscent of the dais upstairs, swirling patterns that almost looked like runes. The door was flanked by two pillars that might once have been carved with figures, but time and erosion had smoothed them into ambiguous shapes. Bran reached out a hand, pressing his palm against the door. The patterns glowed faintly. Jon braced himself, half expecting another shock or violent reaction. But the door simply cracked down the middle, opening inward with a hiss of escaping air. Beyond was a small antechamber, the ceiling low enough that Tormund had to stoop. Torches illuminated a series of steps leading to an altar-like structure of polished ice. Upon that altar lay a sword, or what appeared to be a sword, encased in a sheath of frost. Its blade was nearly transparent, faintly tinged with a pale blue luminescence. Even sheathed in ice, it seemed to exude waves of cold that prickled the skin. Bran gestured for Jon to approach. Jon exchanged a wary look with Tormund, who shrugged helplessly. Then Jon stepped forward. The closer he got, the stronger the cold emanating from the sword became, until it felt like a winter gale was blowing directly at his face. Yet he sensed no immediate danger, only a stern presence, as though the sword itself was testing him. He reached out a gloved hand. The ice around the blade cracked, fracturing into delicate shards that fell away without harming him. Carefully, he lifted the weapon. The handle was bound in some ancient leather that had turned black with age. The blade itself shimmered like a shard of compressed moonlight. It was extremely light, yet rigid. He unsheathed it from its frosty casing, and it slid free with a ringing note that echoed in the small chamber. Immediately, Jon felt a shock run up his arm. This was no ordinary blade. He recalled the first time he had held Longclaw, the Valyrian steel feeling perfectly balanced in his grip. That had been a wondrous weapon, forged in the fires of old Valyria. But this sword was wrought of something else entirely. It was ice given shape, a living embodiment of winter's power. The runic patterns etched along its length flickered in the dim torchlight. Jon had the feeling that if he willed it, the blade could slice through steel, freeze a man's blood with just a scratch, or call forth a tempest of snow with a swing. Bran's expression was both solemn and expectant. "For generations," Bran said in that same hushed, echoing tone. The others carried weapons of ice. The Night King wielded a sword that could shatter lesser steel. This blade is akin to those, but it was sealed away, perhaps because it served a different purpose. That purpose is yours to discover. Jon studied the sword. Its grip fit his hand well enough, though it was cold to the touch even through his gloves. He felt uneasy holding something so intimately connected to the forces he had spent so many years fighting. "I don't understand," he murmured. "Am I meant to use it to fight whom?" Bran's gaze flicked over the sword. "It is a symbol more than a simple weapon. The realm must see that the power of ice is not solely for destruction. We have the ability to keep it from becoming a tool of evil again." Tormund cleared his throat. "Never thought I'd see you holding a sword made of ice, Crow. Is that your new Longclaw?" Jon turned the blade slightly, watching the luminescence shift. He felt a pang of loyalty to Longclaw, which hung at his side. House Mormont's gift had served him faithfully. But he knew in his heart that this new sword was something altogether different, something that demanded a place in his life. "I don't know what to call it," he admitted. "It feels like it has no name." Bran smiled faintly. "Then give it one." Jon thought of the swirling cold, the echo of ancient pacts, the vow they had just made. "Frostfang," he said quietly. The name was simple, but it carried the memory of the Frostfang Mountains beyond the wall, a place that once tested him to the brink. Felt right. Let it be called Frostfang. The atmosphere in the chamber felt dense, as though the air itself was alive with magic. Bran's guard shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Jon sheathed Frostfang in a makeshift scabbard crafted from the ice's casing, though he suspected any normal scabbard would be useless. The sword had a coldness that seemed to warp material around it. He could already see frost forming on the leather of his belt. With the door's hidden treasure claimed, they left the antechamber and returned to the main corridor. Bran insisted they explore further. They came upon more passages that wended through the bowels of the fortress. Many led to collapsed tunnels or dead ends. Some opened into smaller chambers with strange carvings or pools of black ice that shimmered like dark mirrors. In one such chamber, they found a nest of frost spiders, giant arachnids with pale, spindly legs that scuttled away from the torchlight. Tormund wanted to crush them, but Bran advised caution, saying they were part of the fortress's ecosystem. Jon had to wonder how many other strange creatures lurked in these endless halls. Eventually, after hours of exploration, they returned to the central dais. Exhaustion weighed on them, but curiosity still burned in Jon's mind. He looked at Bran. "This fortress, we've awakened it. But can we leave it behind? Should we remain as guardians?" Bran gazed at the swirling patterns in the ice underfoot. "A kingdom must have its seat of power. This fortress is that seat. But you have duties to the free folk and I have duties to the Six Kingdoms. We cannot both remain here indefinitely." He paused. "But in forging our bond with the fortress, we have created a link. A piece of our spirits is tied to this place. When there is danger, it will call to us." Jon felt the weight of Frostfang on his hip. "So, we come when called?" Bran's eyes gleamed with a secret knowledge. "In time, perhaps we can build something more. A new order of watchers, if you will. Not like the Night's Watch of old, sworn to celibacy and seclusion, but guardians in a truer sense. Those who walk between realms and ensure the North remains at peace. That is what you and I shall establish, if we're both willing." Jon's mouth twisted in a wry smile. "I never truly escaped my vows, did I?" "You merely changed them," Bran replied gently. A silence fell. Then Tormund, who had been listening with a furrowed brow, spoke. All this talk of magic and guardians, where does that leave the rest of us? The free folk? You know we don't kneel to kings, but we're not blind to the bigger picture. Neither. Jon placed a hand on Tormund's shoulder. No one's asking you to kneel, but the free folk live in the north. If anything threatens it, be it a new wave of White Walkers or some other darkness from the deep snows, you'd be the first in harm's path. Tormund grunted. Aye, then maybe we keep one eye on this big ice palace. Make sure it doesn't start belching out undead armies while you're off gallivanting. He cracked a small grin. We'll keep watch in your stead. For a price, of course. Jon raised an eyebrow. And that price is? Mead. Proper mead from the south. And some of that sweet Dornish wine, if you can manage it. A laugh escaped Jon's throat, surprising him. The tension in the chamber eased. He nodded. Consider it done. Bran blinked, the corner of his lips curving slightly. Then it's settled, he said. We have responsibilities, and we cannot remain here forever. But let us at least spend a few days more, learning what we can before we depart. Those days passed in a surreal blend of cautious exploration and quiet revelation. Bran spent hours in a half-trance on the dais, communing with whatever essence permeated the fortress. Jon sparred with Tormund and the free folk, though the cold made every movement feel slow, the air biting at their lungs. Frostfang remained slung at Jon's side, an ever-present reminder of the power they had tapped into. Occasionally, Jon would unsheath it, marveling at the shimmering runes. He felt as though the blade was alive, humming with the heartbeat of winter itself. Strange phenomena occurred. Once, they saw flickers of ghostly figures moving through the corridors, shapes that resembled the children of the forest, their large eyes reflecting torchlight. Bran said they were echoes, memories frozen in time. Another time, they heard faint singing, a lilting lament in a language none recognized. It reverberated off the walls, only to fade as they approached. Each incident added to the sense that the fortress was not just a place, but a living repository of all the North's magic and history. At last, the day of departure arrived. They packed their sleds, adjusted Bran's seat, and prepared to journey back to the southern wilds that awaited them. A hush had fallen over the expedition, as though they were leaving something sacred behind. Jon stood at the threshold of the fortress, glancing back at the looming archway and the spires of ice that rose into shadow. He felt a pang in his heart, a mixture of relief and longing. This place, terrifying as it was, felt like the rightful domain of his Stark blood. Bran studied Jon from the corner of his eye. "We will return," Bran said softly. "This is only the beginning." Jon nodded, placing a hand on Frostfang's hilt. "I know." They set out into the tundra, forging a path south. Wind-sculpted ridge. Bran seemed restless. He motioned for Jon to join him near a small fire that one of his guards had lit. The guard gave them space, leaving them alone with the flickering flames. "I have seen glimpses," Bran began, his voice low. "In that fortress, my visions were stronger. I saw futures filled with great wars, others filled with quiet peace. Our actions have changed many paths. But one thing is constant. The world will always need watchers in the north, guardians of the boundary between life and the creeping dark." Jon studied the flames. "And do you see me in those visions?" Bran smiled, a gesture that seemed both nostalgic and comforting. "Yes, sometimes. You hold a sword of ice in your hand. You stand atop the walls of that fortress, looking out into a swirling blizzard. It's not an unhappy vision. There is a sense of purpose there, a sense of belonging." Jon let the words settle. He thought of his life, of how he had once believed his fate was to serve the Night's Watch, never father children, never hold land or title. That identity had been shattered by the revelation of his parentage, only to be replaced by more heartbreak. Yet here, in the North's wild emptiness, he felt more like himself than he ever had. The sword at his side felt like an extension of his soul. Bran's voice softened. "The realm still has kings, lords, and all the complications that come with them. But you and I, we answer to something older and quieter. The future of the North depends on our vigilance. In forging this new ice kingdom, if that's what we are to call it, we are making ourselves keepers of a promise. Not just to the living, but to every soul that has ever called Westeros home. Jon glanced upward, at the swirling auroras painting the sky with faint ribbons of color. I never imagined I'd be forging a kingdom of my own, he said. I never wanted it. Not the way some men do. You're not forging it alone, Bran reminded him gently. You have me. You have the free folk who may yet accept this new reality. You have the memory of our family and all those who came before us. And if in time others join us, knights, rangers, men and women of honor, they too will take the vow to keep darkness at bay. Jon could almost see it. Men and women from across the realms, traveling north to pledge themselves as watchers, forging a new brotherhood not chained by old taboos and prejudices, but united by a singular purpose. A new order, he mused, but not bound by the old rules. Instead of the black cloaks, we might wear something else. Direwolf cloaks, maybe. Bran actually chuckled at that. The symbol matters less than the intent. But yes, they will need a banner to follow, or at least a name to wear proudly. Jon felt the corners of his mouth lifting in a hint of a smile. The Watchers of the Ice, perhaps. Something along those lines, Bran said, nodding. The faint smile lingering on his face made him look, for once, almost like the boy Jon remembered, the boy who had climbed towers and dreamed of nights. But that was fleeting. The calm, distant gravity of the three-eyed raven soon returned to Bran's expression. In the days to come, we will have much to discuss with Sansa, with the lords and ladies of the North. Some will be skeptical, others fearful. But we cannot keep this secret from them. The fortress is not just ours. It belongs to every soul that depends on the North's safety. Jon nodded. I don't imagine they'll be thrilled to learn we awakened an ancient stronghold of the White Walkers. They'll be less thrilled if it had awakened on its own, Bran countered. We must make them see it was necessary, that we've turned that power to our advantage. You're the king, Jon pointed out. That might help. Bran gave a faint, wry shrug. A king's words carry weight, but so do old fears. We'll face it. When the time comes, we'll speak honestly about what we've done and why. Jon agreed, though a part of him wondered if the Southern Lords would ever truly grasp the reality of the North's magic. He remembered how they scoffed at talk of the White Walkers, how only proof and a near apocalypse had convinced them. Would they dismiss him and Bran as dabblers in dark sorcery? Or would they accept that the world was bigger and more mysterious than their politics? They fell into a companionable silence, both reflecting on the enormity of what lay ahead. The fire crackled, and Ghost padded over, settling beside Jon. The night deepened, stars faintly piercing the swirling auroras. Bran eventually withdrew into a quiet repose, letting himself drift into that place of half-vision, half-sleep. Jon stayed awake a while longer, listening to the wind, absently stroking Ghost's fur, feeling the new blade, Frostfang, pressed cold against his side. He thought of everything behind them. Wars, heartbreak, bloodshed, dragons, a Targaryen legacy. And he thought of the path before him. An ice kingdom that spanned the far north, an awakened fortress of wonders and dangers. He felt no small amount of trepidation, but he also felt a stirring of purpose. This was something worth doing, worth devoting his life to. It took them another fortnight to reach the lands more familiar to the free folk, where small clusters of wildling camps dotted the tundra. Word of their approach traveled quickly, and soon they were greeted by men and women who came to stare at the boy king in the strange wheeled chair, and the once crow who carried a sword of ice. Many recognized Tormund, exchanging rough-hewn jokes and curious glances. None dared challenge Jon's or Bran's right to pass, for Ghost and Frostfang alike made quite an impression. At one such camp, they lingered for several days, resting and gathering supplies for the final leg of the journey to the Wall and beyond. Bran spent the time speaking with elders, gleaning old tales of the others and rumored hidden places in the Frostlands. Jon helped settle minor disputes among the free folk, quietly reasserting the camaraderie he had built with them over the course of many years. One night, around a roaring bonfire, an old woman with braided white hair approached them. She looked at Jon with her one good eye, the other scarred shut. She spoke in a raspy voice. "My grandmother told me stories of a fortress of ice in the far north. She said it was the domain of the Snow King. I always thought them bedtime tales." She eyed Jon's blade warily, noticing the faint vapor that rose from it even while sheathed. "Now I see it's real enough." Jon nodded. "It is, but it's not what it was. We've bound it to serve as a guard against the darkness." She spat into the flames. "Darkness is always there. It just bides its time. If you think to hold it back, you'd best be prepared. It has 1,000 faces, some you might not expect." Jon considered her words. She wasn't threatening him, just warning him. "We'll remain watchful," he promised. She gave him a toothless grin. "Good." Then she shuffled off into the ring of shadows beyond the firelight. He watched her go, pondering her caution. 1,000 faces of darkness. Indeed, he had faced the Night King, but even that was only one threat in a world brimming with old sorceries and restless spirits. The comfort he found was that he wouldn't be alone in facing whatever came next. When at last they crossed through the battered remains of the wall, through the tunnel that had once been destroyed at Eastwatch, they found that the patchwork repairs of the Night's Watch were still ongoing. Those black-clad men who remained saluted Bran, somewhat awkwardly, and afforded them passage. The watchers on the ramparts gawked at the living legend of Jon Snow, the Targaryen who had slain a dragon, though rumors always grew more outlandish with each retelling. Jon brushed it off, focusing on their next destination, Winterfell. They traveled swiftly south, the land gradually shifting from tundra to familiar pine forests and rolling hills. Bran's royal party had left behind all but 2 of his guards in the far north, wanting to minimize fuss. Tormund parted ways with them near the last hearth, taking most of the free folk back to their camps, promising to keep one eye on the fortress from time to time. He and Jon shared a tight embrace before parting, each aware that they might not see one another for many moons, if not years. Finally, on a crisp day of weak sunlight, Winterfell's gray walls rose before them. Steam curled from the hot springs, giving the ancient castle a misty halo. Familiar banners snapped in the breeze, the dire wolf of House Stark. Jon felt a pang in his chest, remembering the last time he had ridden through these gates with any semblance of normalcy. Much had changed. They were greeted in the courtyard by soldiers bearing the Stark sigil. Word of Bran's approach had arrived days earlier via Raven. Sansa, Lady of Winterfell, though she deferred to Bran as king, awaited them, standing tall, her auburn hair braided in a loop around her head. Her eyes reflected relief and curiosity at seeing her brother safe, though he had ventured into lands unknown. At her side stood a handful of northern lords and ladies, many of whom Jon recognized. As Bran's sled came to a stop, Sansa stepped forward. She inclined her head in a respectful gesture, less formal than a bow, but acknowledging Bran's rank. Then she bent to hug him, something that made her seem like the sister of old, if only for a moment. "You've been gone so long," she murmured. "We feared you might not return." Bran's eyes flicked to Jon, then back to Sansa. "I had to see to matters in the far north." He paused. "I've learned things that we must speak of privately." Sansa's gaze shifted to Jon, a question in her look. Jon nodded. A swirling tension filled the courtyard as curious onlookers tried to glean some sense of what was happening. One lord, tall and gray-bearded, stepped forward, greeting Jon with a respectful, "Lord Snow." Another, younger and more inquisitive, looked at the faint wisps of cold emanating from Jon's scabbard with wide eyes, but said nothing. Jon could almost feel the hush that would fall once the rumors started spreading. He offered a polite nod to each of them, but said little. His mind churned with how best to explain the fortress, the awakening of ancient magic, the forging of a new vow that transcended the usual feudal order. Soon enough, they were ushered into the great hall of Winterfell. Fires roared in the hearths, banishing the northern chill. Servants bustled with trays of steaming cider, roasted meats, and fresh bread. The smell made Jon realize how hungry he was. Even though they had survived well enough in the north, the diet there had been sparse and monotonous. A private meeting was convened in the Lord Solar, where Sansa, Arya, who had arrived back from her own travels some time ago, Bran, and Jon gathered with only a few close advisors. The tension was palpable. Arya, standing by the window, gave Jon a nod of greeting. She had changed so much from the little girl he once knew, and yet in her eyes, he saw the same fierce independence. Bran, his posture composed, launched into a measured explanation of what had transpired. He spoke of the old magic that lingered beyond the wall, how they had discovered an ancient fortress connected to the power of the White Walkers, and how they had bound that power under their guardianship. He emphasized the necessity of the act, the threat that if left dormant, it might awaken in darkness once more. Sansa listened with a calm mask, though her eyes betrayed shock and concern. Arya frowned, crossing her arms. One of Sansa's advisors, a northern lady named Helwyn Reed, a cousin from the Crannogmen, newly allied with House Stark, interjected with questions about the risk, about whether they might have ignited a second long night. Bran responded patiently, explaining that the bond they formed was meant to guard the realm. Jon added his voice, describing how it felt to stand on the dais, forging that link of ice and blood. Arya exhaled, leaning against the window. So you're telling us there's a new seat of power in the far north, one that belongs to House Stark? Jon and Bran exchanged a look. Not exactly House Stark, Jon clarified, but to the north as a whole, an ice kingdom, if you will, without the usual trappings, a place that stands vigil. Arya shook her head in disbelief, a half-smile quirking her lips. And here I thought I'd seen everything. Sansa's voice emerged firm but quiet. We'll have to call a gathering of the Northern Lords. Explain this carefully. They will have many concerns. But if they trust us, they may accept it. Bran nodded, the light of the fire dancing in his eyes. We will speak to them. The power we awakened will not be used against them, only in their defense. We must make them see that we do not hold illusions of tyranny or conquest. The fortress is a bulwark, not an empire. Sansa's gaze flicked to Jon, taking note of Frostfang. And that sword? She asked. Jon unsheathed it partway, revealing the blade of living ice. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, a cold breath escaping the scabbard. He slid it back in quickly, not wanting to alarm them too much. It's part of the fortress. I don't fully understand its power, but it's a symbol of our bond with that place. Sansa studied it warily. You realize how this will look to the lords. A sword reminiscent of the others' weapons. We'll explain, Bran assured her. They must know we're not becoming the others, but ensuring no one else does. A silence followed, thick with possibility and tension. Finally, Sansa clasped her hands before her. We will hold council in 2 days' time, once the lords have arrived. In the meantime, rest, both of you. You've been through an ordeal. She turned to Jon. It's good to have you home, she added softly, warmth in her tone. Jon felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. He nodded. It's good to be here. Those 2 days passed in a blur. The news of Bran's return and Jon's presence traveled quickly. Lords from various parts of the north converged on Winterfell, curious or anxious about the rumors of a magical fortress. Meanwhile, Jon found himself falling back into the rhythms of Winterfell, if only briefly. He stood on the battlements, remembering countless youthful mornings practicing with swords under Ser Roderick's stern eye. He visited the crypts, paying respects to Ned Stark's statue, feeling the old pang of grief that never quite left him. Arya joined him there once, silent and thoughtful, and they shared a look that needed no words. At last, the day of the gathering came. The great hall was filled with lords, ladies, retainers, and sworn swords, all warmed by towering braziers. Sansa presided over the meeting, with Bran seated beside her in his wheeled chair, wearing a simple crown of weirwood branches. Jon stood to their side, dressed in dark leathers, Frostfang at his belt and Longclaw worn across his back. The presence of 2 swords turned more than a few heads, but no one questioned him outright just yet. One by one, they posed their queries. Lord Serwyn demanded to know if a new army of the dead had been discovered. Lady Mormont's successor asked how they could be sure the fortress wouldn't spawn more White Walkers. Lord Glover voiced fears that House Stark had aligned with some dark sorcery, and so on. Bran and Jon answered as patiently as they could, describing the necessity of controlling the source of the North's magic. The tension in the room ebbed and flowed, with some lords seeming receptive, others openly skeptical. Sansa stepped in to mediate, using her political acumen to reframe the fortress as a protective asset rather than a threat. The Night King arose because the old wards were neglected, she explained. We have no intention of letting that happen again. My brothers, Bran and Jon, risked their lives to ensure it won't. Jon added quietly, we don't want this power for ourselves. It's a responsibility, a burden we bear for the sake of all who live in the North. He felt the weight of Frostfang, as if to underscore his words. Slowly, the mood shifted. While not everyone was convinced, the majority saw the logic. They remembered the horrors of the long night. They knew the threat had been real and could be real again. With the king in the North, as Bran was still affectionately called, even though he ruled the Six Kingdoms, vouching for this arrangement, and Lady Sansa's practical reassurance, the crowd settled into a cautious acceptance. Lord Glover finally exhaled, nodding. Very well, Your Grace. We will trust in your wisdom, as we did when we faced the Night King. Others echoed agreement. Some still harbored doubt, but the official stance became one of guarded approval. That evening, Winterfell's halls rang with a subdued sort of celebration. Drinks were poured, toasts offered, and though tension lingered in some corners, a sense of relief also pervaded. The North might remain safe. They had watchers at the edge of the world once more. Arya found Jon in a quiet corridor after the feast, where he stood gazing into the courtyard, snow drifting under torchlight. You've come a long way from that brooding boy I knew, she said softly, coming to stand beside him. He cast her a sidelong look. Still brooding, I think, just with more to brood about. She offered a small smile. Is this truly what you want? To guard an icy fortress at the end of the world? Jon took a moment to answer. I want peace for the realm. For you, for Sansa, for everyone. If forging a new Ice Kingdom is how I can help ensure that, then yes, it's what I want. Arya studied him, her gray eyes solemn. I believe you, she said. Just don't let it consume you. Don't become as cold as that blade at your side. Jon felt a ghost of a smile. I'll try not to. You'll remind me if I start to freeze over. She nodded. Count on it. Then she reached out and squeezed his hand briefly before turning away, her light footfalls echoing down the corridor. Jon watched her go, a warmth of affection blossoming in his chest. Whatever else happened, he was grateful that Arya and Sansa were here, anchored in the home they had reclaimed. The next day, they prepared for a short journey to King's Landing. Bran needed to return to his seat, to quell any rumors about the North's new developments and ensure the rest of the realm understood that no threat was brewing. Jon had misgivings about going south, but he knew it was necessary for Bran, and perhaps for himself, to show the leaders of the Six Kingdoms that all was under control. Sansa would remain at Winterfell, maintaining the stronghold of the North, while also forging alliances to support the new Watchers if needed. They set out with a modest retinue, enough guards to ensure their safety on the road, though Jon doubted any major threats would appear. The roads south were safer now than they had been in years, with the scars of war slowly healing. Still, old grudges sometimes lingered. Ghosts trotted at Jon's side, though the direwolf's white fur drew more than a few startled looks from travelers they passed. Frostfang remained sheathed at his belt, a silent testament to the power he carried. Whenever the sun's rays touched it, a faint mist wafted from the scabbard, enough to make men whisper behind their hands. Jon paid them little mind, letting them believe what they would. Bran traveled in a covered wagon for comfort on the rougher roads, though he often asked for Jon's company within. They spoke at length of what their next steps might be. Bran considered sending ravens to the Citadel to invite certain maesters who Alizade in arcane lore to study the fortress. Jon was less certain. He worried about meddling scholars who might awaken dangerous forces they didn't understand. But he also saw the value in knowledge, in weaving the fortress into the tapestry of the realm's learning. On the 20th day of travel, they crested a hill to see the sprawling city of kings landing in the distance, the dragon pit perched on a ridge, the red keep shining in the sunlight. Smoke and dust rose from the city's many chimneys and workshops. Bran sighed softly, more to himself than to Jon. This is where we shape the realm's perception. Jon gazed at the city. He remembered the last time he had been here, a prisoner of politics, a Targaryen by blood but scorned by many. He shook off the memory. Now he was a man with a purpose beyond the Games of Thrones. "We'll make them see reason," he said quietly, hoping it was true. They descended into the city, which teemed with people going about their business. Word of the king's return spread swiftly, and a formal reception was arranged. Nobles crowded the courtyard of the Red Keep, eager to greet or slyly assess the king and those who accompanied him. Jon could almost taste the tension in the air. This was a far cry from the stark honesty of the North, but it was part of their reality. Queen Daenerys was gone. Lost in the war, her final fate in some distant land with Drogon, if rumors were to be believed. Cersei was dead, the Lannisters scattered, Tyrion once hand of the king but now estranged from court, traveling the seas, or so the rumors said. King's Landing had changed as the power vacuum shifted. Now it was Bran's seat, though in truth, the city was governed day to day by a council of stewards. They greeted him with the usual pomp, leading him to the throne room where that unimposing seat of black steel had been replaced by a simpler seat of wood and iron, more in line with Bran's vision of a humble monarchy. Jon stood near Bran's side as the king addressed the gathered lords. He delivered a succinct speech about his travels north, about the forging of a new protective seat. He did not delve into the details of magic. Instead, he spoke of ensuring the realm's security, preventing any resurgence of the undead threat, and maintaining alliances with the free folk. His measured tone conveyed a sense of calm inevitability, a reassurance that all was well under his reign. Despite Bran's assurances, Jon could see many of these southern lords were uneasy. They remembered the horrors the North had unleashed upon them in the final war. Undead wights marched through the trident, nightmares brought to life. The notion that the North was again dealing with such powers unnerved them, but they respected Bran's authority. Many had sworn oaths to him. If he said the threat was managed, they had little recourse but to nod and pledge their support, or at least keep silent. Jon felt out of place in the Red Keep. He had little to say to these courtiers, with their perfumed airs and calculated smiles. When the formalities ended, he retired to a smaller courtyard, seeking fresh air. Ghost padded behind him, though the direwolf's presence made a few servants shrink away. The stones underfoot radiated warmth, a stark contrast to the icy fortress of the far north. He stood there, leaning against a pillar, gazing across the city's rooftops. Part of him thought of the future. Soon, he and Bran would return to Winterfell, then beyond, setting the foundation for this new watchful order. The realm would go on, forging alliances, having feasts and celebrations, raising towers and armies. Meanwhile, in the far north, an ancient fortress breathed with quiet power, waiting for the day when it might be needed again. A voice broke his reverie. "You look lost, Lord Snow." Jon turned to see a woman with dark curls and a golden cloak pinned at her shoulder, a captain of the city watch by the look of it. Her expression was mild, curious. He gave a curt nod in greeting. "Just Jon. I'm no lord." She tilted her head. "They say you're half Targaryen, half Stark. You've more claim to a lordship than many here." Jon shrugged. "Titles don't matter much to me. Not anymore." She studied his attire, noting the two swords. "That's quite a pair of blades. One of them seems to freeze the air around it." Jon's hand brushed Frostfang's hilt. "Yes, it does." A flicker of unease passed over her face, but she forced a smile. "Well, if you ever need a guide around the city, you can call on me. It's not as grand as it once was, but it's safer than it's been in decades." "I appreciate that," Jon said politely. He met her eyes, seeing neither fear nor aggression there, just curiosity. Perhaps the story of an icy fortress wouldn't sound so impossible here. Stranger things had happened in the recent past. The wars and dragons had opened many minds to the unimaginable. She nodded, took her leave with a polite bow, and drifted away. Jon lingered a while longer, letting the warm southern breeze brush his face. Then he heard the distinctive sound of Bran's approach, the wheels of his chair moving over cobblestones. Jon turned to see his brother, King Bran the Broken, entering the courtyard alone, a slight smile ghosting his lips. "Done with the formalities?" Jon asked quietly. Bran nodded. "For now, the council has accepted my report. They have their own matters to bicker over: trade routes, taxes, property disputes. It seems far removed from the concerns of the North." Jon folded his arms. "So what now?" Bran gazed at the sky. "I remain for a fortnight, settle some royal business. Then we depart for Winterfell. From there, you and I can finalize the establishment of our Watchers, however that form takes. I suspect the fortress can be visited periodically, until we find those willing to remain there." Jon tilted his head. "And me? Am I to remain in Winterfell, or beyond the wall?" Bran's eyes met his. "That is for you to decide, Jon. You have always been free more than you know. If you choose to return to the far north and oversee the fortress, none will stop you. If you prefer to roam with the free folk, so be it. If you wish to stay in Winterfell and help train new Watchers, that is also your right." Jon let out a breath. "I think I'll go where I'm needed. For now, that may well be the fortress." He paused, thinking of Tormund, of Ghost's contentment in the open tundra, of the quiet longing in his own heart for the majestic hush of that place. "We can't leave it alone. Not indefinitely." Bran nodded knowingly. "Then we'll make the journey when the time is right." He stared into the distance, and for a moment, his gaze went unfocused, as though he saw something far away. "The fortress calls to us, even now, but it's patient. We have time to shape this new kingdom of ice." Jon studied Bran's expression, seeing a flicker of something that might be sadness. "You all right?" Bran offered a reassuring look. "The price of seeing too many paths is that I can't live them all. But I'm all right, Jon. Truly." Jon clasped his brother's hand briefly. They shared a moment of unspoken understanding. Yes, they carried the burden of bridging worlds. Man and magic, south and north, life and death. But neither of them carried it alone. They had each other, and they had the north itself, vast and unyielding, to anchor them. The day passed into evening. Feasts were held. Intrigues whispered through the corridors. Jon attended as much as courtesy demanded, then slipped away to the quiet of the Red Keep's Godswood. Though far smaller than the ancient weirwood in Winterfell, it offered a patch of green serenity under the moonlight. Ghost padded softly beside him, sniffing at the base of a slender white tree. Jon knelt and bowed his head, feeling the presence of the old gods, or at least the memory of them. His hand rested on Frostfang's hilt, the cold radiating into his skin. He felt the swirling power in it, like a sleeping beast. In his mind, the fortress rose, dark spires of ice, echoing corridors, the dais that thrummed with ancient magic, and the figure of living frost that had knelt to them, forging a bond. He wondered if, in some far corner of time, he would become a legend himself, a snow king standing eternal watch over the heart of winter. The thought both unsettled and comforted him, for it gave him a purpose as enduring as the land itself. In the hush of the Godswood, he murmured a prayer, half-formed, half-conscious. He prayed for the living, that they might not forget the lessons of the last war. He prayed for peace, that no new darkness would arise to threaten the realm. And he prayed for guidance, that he and Bran might steer this power toward good rather than evil. For a long while he remained there, breathing in the crisp night air. At length he stood, Ghost pressing close to his side. There was more to do, many days and nights ahead in which the shape of this new ice kingdom would take form. But in that moment, beneath the quiet branches of the Godswood, he felt certain of one thing. He and Bran had forged a future that might spare countless lives the terror of a new long night. And if that future demanded their strength, their unity, and their sacrifice, then so be it. After all, they were Starks, one by birth and the other by choice, and the North had always been their destiny. He left the Godswood behind, returning to the Red Keep's corridors and the swirl of courtly life that was never truly quiet. Yet even as he walked through torchlit hallways and nodded to guards who saluted him, part of him lingered in that far northern fortress, hearing the distant hum of living ice, seeing the shimmering shapes that haunted its halls, feeling the hush of the endless snowfields outside its gates. Already, the cold wind was calling him home.